Welcome to our oral history program. As some of you know, we interview people that can tell us about the early happenings in our area. But today we're going to talk about a place, Fort Montgomery. Ed Trombly is our guest today. He's not an old-timer, but a person that is interested in military history and that leads us into the history of Lake Champlain. Ed lives in Rouse's Point, of course, and he's a retired customs broker. He's been active in the Montgomery Rifle Team. You've been a scoutmaster for 40 years, haven't you, Ed?
Yep.
We all know Lake Champlain's importance to the defense of our country. Can you tell us more about it?
Well, yes. I guess the whole thing began in our defense, as most people know and you're aware of, that the Champlain Valley has been called the warpath of nations. Excuse me. Something in the wrong pipe. It's been called the warpath of nations through the years. The Indians, of course, roved up and down here, raiding on each other, the Iroquois, the Algonquins. And in wartime, of course, during the French and Indian Wars, it was of major importance to both sides. Ticonderoga, the fortifications at Ty, at Crown Point. But as far as U.S. history goes, the importance really began with the punitive expedition. It wasn't a punitive expedition. I guess it was against Quebec, led by General Richard Montgomery, and which brings us into Fort Montgomery. The fort was named after General Richard Montgomery.
He was killed on the battle.
He was wounded.
Montreal, wasn't he?
In the siege of Quebec. It was the siege of Quebec, which was led by him. And Arnold was second in command. There are many times that Benedict Arnold, thought he was first in command. But there was a little bit of rivalry between the two of them. But Montgomery was mortally wounded in Quebec at the siege and died on the way, the withdrawal, as they prefer to call it, rather than a retreat, and died somewhere in the vicinity of Montreal. And he was, I guess, temporarily interred there, or somewhere in that area. And his remains were later transferred to St. Paul's Churchyard in New York City, where he's his final resting place. But they led it, and it wasn't successful against Quebec, so they had to withdraw. And the withdrawal was back down through the Champlain Valley. And at that time, Arnold didn't go all the way through. He stopped down at Skeensboro, which is present-day Whitehall, and the proper term, I guess, would be built a fleet of cockle shells and schooners and
that's
small craft. That's Whitehall now.
That's their claim to fame, isn't it? That first Navy?
That was our first Navy. That was the Lake Champlain Navy. And when he got this together, he brought it up here to protect this end of the lake against the British invasion, and Burgoyne did, in fact, invade. And he started his journey. He had a fleet. They weren't big craft then, but and at Valcour Island, of course, the British, Burgoyne's Navy, won the battle. But it was significant because Arnold's fleet had slowed them down enough so that it stopped their fall campaign, and they wintered up in this area in Quebec, in Montreal, in the area, and which led to our being able to more strongly defend and get our troops together in the Saratoga vicinity, which eventually led to the Battle of Saratoga, which was a major U.S. victory, and actually stopped Burgoyne's thrust into the heart of the colonies.
I was reading where Burgoyne was claimed to be the most professional leader of an army that was ever sent to America, and he was a very colorful person.
Oh, yes. I've heard
a wise leader, but he still fought in the European way, and the wilderness and the Indians and their type of fighting really defeated them. They wore their heavy armament and their boots, and in the wilderness they bogged down, and the soldiers suffered a great deal from the uniforms and the heat and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's true.
They had the Germans too. The German Hessians were there, and they fought in the old manner and still suffered a great deal from their uniforms and things.
A common misconception, Don, in what you're talking about there is you're in warfare, is that we hid behind trees and stone walls. Well, we didn't. We fought in the European manner too, because the armament of the day, with the exception of a couple of companies of riflemen, Morgan's Riflemen, and
Rogers
a couple
Rangers
of others.
too, right?
Well, Rangers, they weren't fighting with rifles. No, they fought with that was smoothbore muskets.
I guess I better keep still when it comes
No,
to
no, no,
military.
no, no. That's right. It's a good point to bring out because it is commonly believed we fought more of a guerrilla warfare than they did. But our tactics and the tactics that von Steuben taught the Army in Valley Forge was the European tactics, and we had to use it because of the short range and inaccuracy of a smoothbore 69 caliber musket, which eventually led to bayonet charges.
And I thought it was interesting, the little reading I've done getting ready for this, that the farmers and the people in the countryside helped to defeat Burgoyne by burning their crops and devastating the countryside. They really, everyone fought in that war.
Oh yeah. Well, usually when it's on your home soil, everybody's in the battle.
I guess that's true.
So, but as I say, the importance and significance of this area, and you mentioned Burgoyne, and Burgoyne was a professional soldier. There is no question about it. But so the Battle of Saratoga didn't exactly win the Revolution, but it was a big shot in the arm for the colonies. It induced enlistments and re-enlistments so that we got more troops and some of the militia to stay over from their original enlistment. And here again, Arnold was a hero. I just want to bring this out. Benedict Arnold, as we know, is a traitor. But he was a hero at Saratoga because he turned one of the flanks of Burgoyne's army, which led to the successful conclusion on our favor.
I was reading that when Arnold was dying, he died in England, and on his last words he said, "I wish if I had my life to live over, I'd never taken my American uniform off."
Yeah, oh yeah.
If he regretted his.
Well, there's a lot of, I guess it has to be mostly conjecture and rumor, but he was afraid that with our alliance with France, that the King of France was going to take over the United States, and if he had his druthers, he'd rather have the King of England as his ruler.
Well, I suppose there's many ways to look at it, aren't there?
But he was wounded in the leg at Saratoga, which is quite a point of trivia here. And if you go down to the Saratoga battlefield, the Daughters of the American Revolution put up a monument down there to his leg. There is a monument which has his leg on it, and that's the only thing that they figured was honorable in his body. So, but
I was reading that the War of 1812 led the British to feel that, or the Americans, excuse me, to feel that our area was very important it was necessary to build some fortifications here to prevent any more raids on our own country, right?
Well, we had to build fortifications here.
That was the beginning of our own fort.
Yeah, well, it was. It led to the Battle of Shellick Champlain, led to the construction of the fortifications up here, which, if I may expand on that just a little bit, McDonough, Commodore Thomas McDonough, he was called a Commodore. That's an honorary title. He was actually a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy. He was sent up here to command a squadron on Lake Champlain. And when he got here, there wasn't much of a squadron, but the importance of it, and the war was in progress in 1813 and 1814. And the British, under a Captain Downey, was reconstructing a ship of war in about St. John's after they'd torn down and carried it over the rapids. And McDonough felt he had to do something to counteract that, and that led to the construction of the Saratoga, which nothing of it exists today, but the Saratoga was built in Vergennes, Vermont. And a interesting fact about this, which I don't think a lot of people know, is work commenced we don't have the exact date, but started chopping the trees in May, and on April 11th, the ship was launched into Otter Creek in Vergennes.
They really were fast
Now,
builders,
it wasn't rigged, but that's 35 working days from the time they started felling the trees to a ship in the water. And it wasn't people...
Where do you get a fact like that? Where do you,
well, one of the I'm going to mention a bibliography is The Proudest Day is a book about the Battle of Lake Champlain. It's very good. There are other, the construction of it is in Chappelle's The History of the American Sailing Navy. Mm-hmm. But this, a lot of people think that we're talking about what you see at the marinas down here. Well, that's not fact, because the Saratoga was 143 feet 6 inches long with a beam of 36 feet 4 inches.
A lot larger than we imagined,
Yeah,
huh?
she carried 26 guns, 24 pounders and 32 pounders.
Maybe this is just a childish question, but what about the Royal Savage? Wasn't that part of his?
No, the Royal Savage was Benedict Arnold's flagship.
Oh,
That was the construction that he made. That was a sloop of war. The mast arrangement was different. The Saratoga was 3-masted, a full ship. It wasn't called a ship; it was called a corvette, as the progression from a full ship of the line, a frigate, and the next smaller would be a corvette. She was a shallow draft.
Doesn't mean much.
Well, it was from the keel, a ship that long, from the keel to the railing on her side was only about 18 feet, and she drew between 9 and 10 feet of water fully berthed. And I think she was right around 60 gross tons, as opposed to the Confiance, which was Captain Downey built in St. John's, or rebuilt and brought down here to fight the Battle of Lake Champlain with, was 110 tons and considerably larger, and it was outgunned the Saratoga by about 5 guns, and they were bigger guns. The total fleets that were here, that went into the battle, were, as I say, Downey's flagship Confiance, and I think he had 4 or 5. He had a brig of war, and McDonough had more vessels, but there was a lot of gondolas, gunboats, with just one gun mounted in them. They were a big rowboat, is what they were, with a gun mounted in the bow. But by superior seamanship, and there's no question about it, with superior seamanship, he used different tactics that, we're talking about Fort Montgomery, so we're not going to go into the definite tactics of it. But the battle raged all day. Downey was killed in the battle. McDonough escaped very serious injury when a mast fell across him when he was sighting a gun. And we won the battle, and so they didn't go back licking their wounds. There was nothing to go back. The eyewitnesses of the day say that there wasn't a mast standing. And I've read this in 2 different books by 2 different authors, so there must be some credence to it. That an old British sailor was quoted as saying, "I was at Trafalgar with Nelson, and that was but a flea bite to this." So it was quite a bloody battle, and the controversy that's raging now over Crab Island, of course, is renewing the interest in this. But I think that's basically what we wanted to talk about, is the importance before we get into the fort. And if you can add anything,
Well, I'm not really. I'm more interested in the fort.
Okay.
So they felt it necessary to build a fortification here, and then the fort began in 1816, didn't it?
Yeah. Another thing that we got to look at with forts, and it's the coastal fortification system of the United States, and especially inland waters, is the fact that forts are a lot less expensive than ships
Really?
to build, maintain.
I mean, that fort with all its stone?
No, that fort would be, the initial expense would be greater. But now, as you know, it was never garrisoned with regular troops. It was never meant to be garrisoned with a lot of troops. There probably would have been the total garrison of that fort probably would have been 40 to 50 men, because they had an installation to call on for manpower.
The book said it was built for 800 men, the most.
It could house them,
Oh,
but
I
they
see.
didn't need that until they could get the conscripts, or there was no conscripts until the Civil War, until they could get the enlistments, the militia. They could man it with a handful of men.
Because the point was so narrow.
Yeah, unless there was a threat. Any of these coastal defenses could be manned initially until an emergency arose, and then they could rush in. Now, we had the Plattsburgh barracks down there, and they could have been moved up here to help man those guns. And both of these people up here were cross-trained in artillery as well as infantry, and they were only militia, workmen militia.
I
But
read where
nonetheless,
they called in some of the soldiers to work on the fort too. from
They did.
Plattsburgh area, when it
Yeah,
first
well,
started.
yeah, when they first started. And then they decided that the road from Plattsburgh to Military Turnpike, from Plattsburgh to Hopkinton, was more important, so they dragged them out of there to build that road. So,
All sorts of
and then
plans.
we hired local people, and then they decided they wanted to cross-train them as soldiers, so they did, and we had more or less a militia establishment.
Well, let's begin. Let's think about the fort now.
Okay, well, we've established the reason and the need for a fort. So I don't, the exact date, it's early in the 19th century that a fort, of course after the war, that a fort was started on Island Point. And of course, let's go back just a minute to the War of 1812. The Battle of Plattsburgh was fought on September 11th. Battle of Lake Champlain, McDonough's victory, was September 11th, 1814. And the significance of it was that it determined, it alone determined that the British could not invade this country. So they, in essence, gave up. Well, by giving up, they got to sue for peace. And the treaty was signed on, it's called the Treaty of Christmas Eve, the Treaty of Ghent, in December 24th, 1814, was signed.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, as I say, now after the war, we decided that we needed a fortification. Island Point was an ideal location. They surveyed it and discovered that that was the place to build it. Well, they started construction, and they were quite well along when it was discovered that the Treaty of Ghent specified that the 45th parallel was the boundary between Canada and the United States. Well, with this discovery, the fort was in Canada, and came to be known as Fort Blunder. What happened then is that they still had the need for a fort, but of course they couldn't build it in Canada. And along those lines, I don't know, you and I discussed it the other day when we were briefing this over. There's a boundary marker somewhere about halfway between Rose Avenue and a bridge road.
Yes,
And you've seen it. I don't know if it's still there or not.
Oh,
It's
yes,
in one of
it's
the
right
is
down
it there?
the-
Yeah, somebody, if anybody's interested, they can go see it. And that was a boundary marking the 45th parallel. And you can see it's about 2/3 of a mile from the present border. But our work was suspended completely on that fort, and as I said,
Ed, before you go on,
yeah.
I have, when they were looking through the archives in our village, they found the records of the building of Fort Blunder.
Oh, that's Fort Blunder you had.
Yeah, and
Oh.
This is the first agreement signed by, well, I'll just read what it says. These are articles of agreement dated November 1st, 1816 for building of Fort Blunder, signed by Colonel Joseph Totten. And his these men were Scotsmen from, they were stonecutters, and their name were Martin, McIntyre, and Stewart. And this is the original document. Of course,
No.
well, the writing is very beautiful, and
Oh, yeah.
and this is the
script.
original document, 1816. And also we have this one. When they stopped the fort, when they stopped the work on the fort, these men were owed quite a bit of money, and they asked for payment. And this is the document in which they asked for payment. This was very difficult to read, but someone read it at one time and wrote it down.
Yeah.
And we also
That's
have
interesting.
we have another one. It's this is an itemized statement by Stewart and Martin and McIntyre of damages due from the United States, and they itemized the money owed them on the side. Amounts in the thousands.
Now,
of
is
dollars.
that for work?
Well, I couldn't really read it
No.
clearly. It's mostly about stonework and the work of labor of moving the stone from Isle of Mont.
Oh,
That's where the
I'm from Grand Isle.
Grand Isle, and some from Kings Bay too.
Yeah. I had heard that. I don't think I've ever seen that documented.
Well, they're originals.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, so, and they started looking for alternate sites because this end of the lake needed fortifications, and what they came up with was we could build fortifications on Stony Point, which is where the breakwater is today, and there are homes down there now, and on Windmill Point. And that would control the narrows, the mouth of the Richelieu, or whatever they have deemed it to be Lake Champlain or the Richelieu River out here. Well, that went right up to the point of actually drawing up contracts for the purchase of the land. A lawyer, I can't remember his name, from Plattsburgh, is the one that handled the agreements to purchase the land necessary to construct these fortifications. And then along came the treaty of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1844, and that reestablished the boundary on its where we had always thought it was. And I can't tell you what it is right now, 49, 48, somewhere around there. So here again we have Island Point back in our possession and the ruins of the partially constructed Fort Blunder.
I was reading in John Ross's book, it happened here that much of the stone, when the fort was left for 25 years, it was completely, the local people had a field day. They moved in and took the stone, and the stone building opposite the Dabbing Saxony is a lot of the stones from that fort, and General Thurber's house too, which is now the Spiegel home. And the Methodist Church, a lot of the stone came from the fort too, and they did that. And the reason the first fort didn't last so long is because it was built on quicksand, according to John. They rebuilt it. Of course, they made deeper pilings. And
some of these pilings, I understand, are in there 50 feet or more.
Mm-hmm.
So that's so we began construction on that fort, or reconstruction, or what if you will. But it is not Fort Blunder as common legend goes. This was Fort Montgomery from the first pile driven by the steam-driven pile drivers that were, I guess, something to see in the hugeness of them, something that had never been seen in this area. And we were just talking about driving piles, and some of them go down over 50 feet. And that's a long way to drive a pile into the ground. But they must have done something. The engineers that were doing that had to have some knowledge of the area, because there isn't a stone out of place of what's standing down there that is warped out or faltered out.
I thought it was interesting that the work was very slow on the building of the fort until after the Civil War, and Lincoln really began to appropriate money to really put it in motion. And then it almost was fully armed by 1865, according to.
That Ross's book mentions that. You mentioned Totten you have there. Totten went to later fame. You know, he has a fort named after him in Washington, which was part of the Washington defenses during the Civil War, Fort Totten.
He never lived to see the fort completed, according to John Ross.
Probably not.
You want to show some of the pictures of the fort?
I'd like to, first I'd like to explain a little bit about fortifications, and then we'll get into that. This type of a fort is nearly all forts, not fortifications, which are a single line of breastworks. A fortification is a polygon in shape, the square and the pentagon being the common ones. And this fort was pentagonal. In other words, it was 5 sides. You could call it sided. It wasn't really 5-sided, and we can point that out on an aerial view. But and it was double casemated, which means it had two decks for gun emplacements. It was it's a bastioned fort is the term, and if you'll hold that one up now, Don, I'll explain a bastion fort, and then we'll go back to the Pentagon. These things here are what's termed. There are 3 major parts to a bastion fort: the curtains, the lunettes, and the capitals. Now, I can't show you a capital. I'll explain what a capital is on there. The sides are the curtains, if you will, and the points that stick out on each corner of this pentagon are lunettes. Now, if you'll put that one down and hold that other one up, I can probably point out a little more on that. I think you better straighten it so there's no reflection. You can see this is the ruins now, and I think you can see, if I blend your face, I apologize, Don.
Quite all right.
The first curtain, the western curtain, and the southern curtain, the southeastern curtain, the northeastern curtain, and the north curtain, protected by the lornettes. lunettes, not lorgnettes. Lorgnettes is something an opera lady wears, isn't it?
Glasses, I guess.
And these are built so as to protect entirely the fort. The western part, of course, being on land, was protected by a moat and a berm.
I remember the moat. I remember
Oh
the
yes,
fort.
the moat, and I don't remember the drawbridge. I'm not. No, we won't go into the ages. Being the gentleman that I am.
No,
But
no.
this is the way the fort was constructed. The capitals are angles that are shot and laid out and known before construction, which converge in a center on all to each lunette. And this is how they determine the angles of fire to get the interlocking fire that would prevent anything from moving in there or anything coming in there.
Very technical.
But that's what the fort is. The closest fort that I can think of in the eastern United States that is built pentagonal about the same way, probably not quite as long a idle curtain, is Fort Schuyler, which is in Fort Schuyler, New York, where the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy is today. So that's basically what we're talking about with a fort. Now, if you get that one up.
The small one?
Yeah. The fort was armed. These holes here, you've probably heard in the local terminology sally ports. Well, they're not sally ports. A sally port is something a man goes in and out of. These are called embrasures.
I never heard either one.
An embrasure. An embrasure is what a gun goes out of. A gun is mounted in there. Now, these guns are on special carriages that allows them to be swept to make a sweep.
You have a picture of that.
Yeah, you can see that. But they also now, that carriage is quite unique from what you see on an artillery type of thing out in the field, or a ship, because a ship is on a sturdy wooden carriage. But you remember that anything like a fortification or a ship, these cannon were loaded from the front end. Now, they can't very well go outside the fort and load them, so they have to be run in. Now, the wheels for the traversing won't go over that track. So the gun is on a carriage that allows it to be racked back on a rack and gear
I can almost
for
visualize
loading.
that.
And it has to be drawn in, sponged, loaded, run out again, and fired, and at the command whatever they were. We're talking about cannon now, and if for your people's information, it was armed with 10-inch cannon, 10-inch Rodmans, and that 10 inches means that the ball was 10 inches in diameter.
Wow.
That's a pretty big size cannon. And they're cannons, they're not howitzers. They're mean to be shot at point of aim. 10-inch Rodmans, 8-inch Rodmans. They had 32-pound Columbiads.
You really know your artillery.
Well, firearms is a fascinating study, and warfare is a fascinating study. Let's learn more about it so we don't have any more.
That's for sure.
And 24-pound flanking defense guns. These flanking defense guns would quite possibly have been, well, this is you're looking at possibly, the way that looks to me is the southwestern lunette, which was facing the land side, and this was where your flanking guns would be, your 24-pounders. A 24-pounder is about 5.25 inches in diameter. So this would have not been for ships, it would have been anti-personnel that would have been attacking the fort from the land side. But these guns would hold a ship at the distance that they had there, and
narrow point.
with this thing, and the guns were in place. There were two 15-inch Rodmans that were not mounted. They were there to be mounted. I have no idea where they were thinking of doing it. Quite possibly on the northwestern, or northeastern and southeastern lunettes. But from the sources that I have, and I knew they were there, I discussed it with some of my fellows, and they say they were never mounted. They were there, but they didn't mount them. So now, this one here, you'll see a better picture of the moat and the drawbridge, and again, the lunettes. And you'll notice this pictures here, they're very narrow. There are some of these in the first casemate of the lakeside, and these are embrasures for musketry. This is for, and we got to say musketry. We can't say, we would use the term riflemen today, but they weren't rifles; they were muskets. So they were
I'm not
musketeers,
going to ask you the difference. because we
infantrymen.
haven't got
Well, one
time.
has rifling and the other doesn't. But those little narrow ones, and you know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
I
You've
do.
seen them, but you can see them well defined in almost any picture of the fort. These are embrasures for musketry, and that's basically what we had down there for a fort.
I can remember these high banks, you know.
Oh
the
yeah,
kids would be
yeah,
down there.
yeah.
They're marvelous
And,
to slide on.
And here again you have the, which side is that? May I just look at that down for a moment? Yeah, that's the south side of the fort. Well, again, well defined, and that's part of the ruins that are still there. The lunette, the curtain, and the southern lunette. Now it's and by these lunettes you can get raking fire. You know, that somebody tried to attack this, another part of that fort would come to its defense with its own fire.
I see. Mow them down, in other words.
Oh yeah, get them out of there. Here we have a picture, and I think, again, that this is the southern wall that's still intact, the southern curtain, the inside, and the doors leading to the casemates.
I can just vaguely remember the fort in this state.
Yeah, that's a little early for me.
We used to
It
go
wasn't that good.
We used to go skiing over the lake and go in the fort and have picnics, you know, cook hot dogs in the
Yeah.
fireplaces. And these officers' quarters were all
No,
like,
that's not that part of it now.
Oh,
This is the southern.
well,
See, that's the casemates in there. You'll see a better picture in one of your bigger pictures there of the.
well, anyhow, we used to have a good time
Yeah. Oh yeah.
after it was all
And this
over.
is one of the fireplaces in one of the rooms,
Probably.
one of the quarters. I think, yeah, you're looking, no, I want you to, I didn't put that one out, in
Oh,
particular.
this was the door. Wasn't this the door of the
No.
fort?
Yeah, that's the door. I'm
me.
sorry. That is the door. Where there's a fireplace in there somewhere that I had out of
Yeah.
line. Okay, you'll notice a difference if you'll look at that. This is the front of the fort where the quarters were.
Oh, I see.
And this, of course, here would very likely be the northern curtain. And this is when they were destroying the fort to build a bridge. And that wasn't just officers' quarters. That was the quarters for the troops. Because
Very elaborate.
if you look at
Yeah.
this here, and come over here in that northeast, southwestern lunette was the ovens and the mess areas. Now, where the guns are, the casemates, they could have rigged sleeping quarters in there. If they'd had a full-blown battle, they would have rigged hammocks, much as they did in those days in sailing ships. But for the most part, the front wall, the western wall, was for the most part the quarters. The reason being that they used these smaller guns, they didn't take up as much room, and they had the embrasures for the musketry, and they could do that in sleeping quarters. Now the officers were very likely on the second floor with plugs to put in the.
I can remember the fort when it looked like this at times. This is the part they took down.
That's a casemate. Well, no, that was any part of the curtains, except for the western wall, the western side. The tracks, of course, are for the traversing of the cannon.
I understand now. I didn't
And
know.
they were nearly permanent on that part, but that gun barrel still had to be racked back to be loaded. And I'm sure that's the way they used them on here. I have no evidence of exactly what they used. There were several different types of carriages, and I'm not going to go into that. But
This is very-
there's your fireplace.
There's our fireplace.
Yeah, one of the fireplaces.
I've seen larger ones than that
Yeah.
in the fort.
The stonework, the
remember
masonry was fantastic down there.
Beautiful.
I guess they're marble or granite stairs, and just set so precisely that they almost look like there was no support to them.
Beautiful.
But I can remember those, and I'm sure you can. These steps, like this, were in the lunettes leading up to the top of the fort, which was earthen.
Did they ever, this is a stupid question, did the men ever get on top of the fort to protect it? Would they ever
I
get
don't
on
think
top?
they ever went on top of it to protect it, but they went on top of it for patrol probably and for lookout purposes.
You see the Western movies, you know.
Oh well, you're looking at
I'm not much
Hollywood.
of a military
Hollywood
person.
in its greatest.
Yeah. This is the sad part, right?
Yes, it
Do
is.
you want to mention any
No,
more before?
you do that.
Well, this is when Andrew Weston bought the fort from the community in the 1930s, and this is shows a picture of it being taken down. Yeah. I guess they had quite a difficulty getting it apart too, didn't they?
Yeah. There's not much.
And our last picture is just an overview of the fort, right?
Yeah, and there again you can see the distinct pentagonal shape of the fort with the western wall, and it's just a shame that it's gone, but it's gone, and
As we know,
all we can do now is study it, and I think that's what we're doing. We're trying to encourage more people to study this. I think that's the whole basis of your program, and your program is doing one fine job, I
well,
think.
we're trying.
Okay.
I also read that William McComb was the first caretaker of the fort after it was more or less left alone, you know.
Yeah,
Was
yeah.
not garrisoned at all. And then Sergeant Young lived in Rouse's Point. He was the only colored man in Rouse's Point for years. And he took care of the fort. And when I can remember people talking about Sergeant Burke, and of course he lived, the Burke family still lives here.
Yeah.
And we know Victor Pod owns the fort now, and he's trying to sell it, but there it is. It's been a ruin for years, hasn't it? We're doing the same thing now. We did the same thing they did to Fort Blunder, taking it apart.
Yeah,
piece by piece.
yeah, oh yes, yes. The present fort has built a lot of backyard fireplaces in this village.
You think so?
No, there's a lot of fire brick taken out of that fort.
Well, we've had some good times and picnics there, haven't we?
Yes,
American Legion
yes,
parties.
yes. I don't think we should mention some of those on the
No,
air.
no, I guess we better not. Well, I want to thank you, Ed, for all your interesting remarks about the fort and military history. And we want to be sure and thank Peg Barcombe for pictures. She let us use the pictures. And in our own Dodge Memorial Library, we have many books that tell the history of our fort in this area. And our oral history group, Mrs. Lavoie and the Martinsons and myself, and we are collecting books through the help of the village, collecting books concerning this area. Of course, Mr. Fitzpatrick is in our group too. Ralph Nader Hill's new book on Lake Champlain tells a great deal of history of this area and the battles that promoted the use of the
I
fort.
haven't read it yet.
It's very good. Well, and again, I want to thank New Channels for their help with this program and Hometown Cable.
If I may add just two, I'd like to see the younger people that are watching this show get a little more interested in this all of history, but particularly the Champlain Valley, their home. If someone is looking for a little knowledge about the Montgomery expedition and the Battle of Valcour Island, Kenneth Roberts' book, A Rabble in Arms, and I would have the library have it. Kenneth Roberts,
They do
of course,
have it,
it's
I
a
know.
novelized, but it sticks pretty well to fact. And if you want to read about McDonough's signal victory, as he called it, to the War Department on Lake Champlain, the book to read, I think, The Proudest Day, and that was written by a Charles Muller, and that's a very fine piece of work on the whole aspect of when McDonough took control of the squadron on Lake Champlain. And I thank you for allowing me to share what I know with your viewers, and if I can help in the future, let me know.
We'll be glad to call on you, Ed. Thank you very much.